Why did the SEAL commander stop, talking mid-sentence, the moment she lifted the Barrett from its case? Even before he realized what he was seeing, something in her movements froze him, the kind of stillness born not from hesitation, but from precision. The Nevada desert stretched wide and blinding around the training compound, morning light scattering off the steel of distant targets. Dust hung suspended, gold-tinted in the heat, and the only sound came from the low, metallic rhythm of cleaning rods and bolts being checked. Sarah Chen sat cross-legged on the concrete pad, her rifle in pieces before her like a surgeon's instruments. There was a calm to her that didn't belong in a place built for competition and ego. No wasted motion, no nerves, just focus. Commander Jake Morrison watched through binoculars from the tower, the same way he had watched hundreds of recruits. But this one, this quiet woman with the almost mechanical precision, was different. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't performing. She was remembering. He didn't know that, of course, not yet. Down on the range, the others had learned to leave her alone. Some had tried small talk the day she arrived. One corporal had joked about her choice of rifle, the Barrett M82 a 1.50 caliber, too heavy for most, too brutal for long sessions. She hadn't replied, just looked at him for a moment, not unkindly but with eyes that seemed to ask a silent question. Have you ever depended on one of these for your life? By the second day, no one spoke to her unless necessary. And by the third, even Morrison found himself watching from a respectful distance, unsure why this woman's presence carried so much quiet weight. He descended the tower stairs, boots crunching against gravel. The sun had climbed higher, heat already radiating from the concrete. Sarah didn't look up when he stopped beside her. "That's quite a rifle," he said, nodding toward the Barrett. She finally glanced up, squinting slightly against the glare. "It takes some getting used to," she said softly, her tone even. "But once you understand its personality, it becomes reliable." Morrison smiled faintly. "Personality, huh? Most people describe that rifle as a punishment." "Most people don't listen to what it tells them," she said. He watched her hands move, steady, confident, scarred. The kind of scars that come from years of harsh environments, not training mishaps. She inspected every component twice before sliding the bolt assembly into place with a soft click that sounded almost intimate. "You've been shooting long." "A while." Her answer was distant, almost reflective. "My father taught me to shoot small rifles when I was 10. He said understanding recoil was like understanding consequences." The line lingered in the air between them. Consequences. Morrison found himself studying her face, the faint shadow beneath her eyes, the subtle way her posture shifted whenever someone else entered her periphery. Awareness like that wasn't learned on a range. It was survival instinct. He crouched down, lowering his voice. "You came here through unusual channels, your files thin. That normally means classified work. Should I be worried?" Sarah's faint smile didn't reach her eyes. "No reason to be. I'm here to qualify just like everyone else." He wanted to press further, but something about her tone told him the wall wouldn't break easily. So he changed direction. "Qualification, tomorrow. Course runs 600 to 1200 meters. You'll find it straightforward." Her gaze lifted slightly, curious. "What's the record?" 8 out of 10 hits at 1200. One of my instructors holds it." She nodded once, thoughtful. "And the longest distance on the property?" Morrison blinked. "We've got a 2,000-meter test range, equipment trials mostly, not used for qualification." "Could I use it sometime?" That confidence again, quiet, unwavering. She wasn't asking permission so much as measuring how far his curiosity might stretch. He hesitated only a moment. "We can arrange it after qualification." As he walked back toward the control building, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just agreed to something important. He told himself it was professional interest, but deep down he knew it was more than that. There was something about this woman, her silence, her discipline, that felt like the calm before a revelation. At dawn, the air was still cool. A thin layer of desert dust clung to the shooting mats, and the scent of gun oil lingered in the breeze. Sarah arrived early, carrying the rifle case like it weighed nothing. She laid it out with care, her expression unreadable as the rest of the trainees chatted nervously nearby. Morrison positioned himself behind the spotting scope. The other instructors watched too, trying not to show curiosity. The first target stood 600 meters away, already a challenge for most. She studied the range flags, the shimmer of heat already starting to rise. Then, without fuss, she lay prone and adjusted the scope. The sound of the first shot broke the silence like thunder. Direct hit. The metallic ring echoed faintly across the valley. Morrison's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. At 800 meters, same result. At 1,000 again, dead center. No wasted effort, no excitement, just calculation, breath, trigger, impact. When she reached 1,200 meters, the others began to falter. A few missed entirely, one barely clipped his target. Sarah took longer this time, watching the wind shift across the flags. When she fired, the target shuddered once, perfect hit, center mass. The range fell silent, except for the slow echo of the shot. Morrison looked through the scope again just to confirm. Dead center. She hadn't even adjusted after the first round. He exhaled through his teeth. "That's 4 for 4, his assistant muttered. "Yeah," Morrison said quietly, "and she's not even stretching." He walked over as Sarah cleared her rifle. "That's exceptional shooting," he said. She gave a small nod, eyes still on the weapon. "Distance is just a number," she murmured, "once you understand the wind." But Morrison saw it now, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided the admiration of the others. She wasn't proud, she was remembering. Later that day, he opened the restricted system to dig deeper into her record. Most of it was redacted, entire pages replaced by black bars. All he could confirm was that she'd transferred from an undisclosed operational unit 3 weeks ago, under direct authorization from the Defense Intelligence Command. That level of clearance wasn't routine. Still, he told himself, maybe she was just that good. Maybe she had the kind of natural ability that didn't need an explanation. But when dusk came, he found her again on the range, working alone. The others were gone, their laughter echoing faintly from the barracks. Sarah sat by her Barrett, cleaning it again methodically, the ritual calm and hypnotic. He watched in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You don't stop, do you?" She didn't look up. "Maintenance keeps you honest. You already shot better than anyone here. That doesn't mean tomorrow won't demand more." Morrison leaned on the rail, studying her. "You ever operate overseas?" Sarah paused. For a second, just a flicker, her hand stopped mid-motion. "I've worked in environments that required adaptation," she said. "Different terrain teaches different lessons." That was all. He almost laughed, the most disciplined deflection he'd ever heard. "You sound like someone who's lived half their life in combat zones." She didn't respond, just resumed wiping the barrel, eyes distant now, as if seeing some landscape beyond the desert, mountain air, thin and biting, valleys stretching for miles. He decided to try a softer approach. "You know," he said, "I've trained over 100 snipers. The great ones always have one thing in common. They shoot like they're at peace with something the rest of us are." She finally looked at him. "Peace doesn't come from hitting targets, Commander. It comes from knowing why you pulled the trigger in the first place." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The desert wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of cordite from earlier exercises. The light was fatting, turning everything bronze. Morrison nodded slowly. "You'll have the 2,000-meter range tomorrow," he said. "I'm curious what you'll do with it." She gave a quiet nod. "So am I." Night settled over the facility, and Morrison lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily above his bunk. He'd seen extraordinary shooters before, Olympic-level marksmen, special operations veterans, instructors with lifetimes of experience. But something about Sarah Chen defied comparison. He thought about the way she treated that rifle, not as a weapon but as a lifeline. The way her focus deepened when she was alone. The faint sadness that hung in her silence. He found himself wondering, not what she'd done, but what it had cost her. Tomorrow he'd find out more. Tomorrow he'd watch what happened when someone like her met the horizon and measured it not in distance, but in memory. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah Chen hadn't come to Nevada just to qualify. She had come to remember what it felt like to breathe without the weight of the next shot waiting. And the Barrett lying beside her, it wasn't just steel and optics, it was history. Every scratch, every adjustment told a story she never spoke aloud. She lay awake too, staring at the ceiling of the small barracks room, listening to the hum of the air conditioner. In her mind, the Nevada desert blended with another landscape, one half a world away, colder, higher, lonelier. A place where silence could save lives, and a single breath meant the difference between living with guilt or dying with purpose. She had come here to start over, but as the night stretched on, she couldn't stop hearing that voice from the past, the one that always whispered before every mission, "Don't miss." Sarah closed her eyes, exhaled slowly, and let the memory fade. Tomorrow she would shoot again, not for record, not for recognition, but to remind herself that even in peace, she could still face the horizon and hold steady. And somewhere between those long breaths and the quiet hum of the desert, the ghosts of her past waited, patient as ever, for dawn to return. Sarah paused for a fraction of a second, just enough for Morrison to notice. Her fingers, still wrapped around the cleaning rod, hesitated before continuing their smooth, rhythmic motion. "I've worked in a few places," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the barrel. "Different terrain, different rules." He caught the subtle shift in her voice, like she was weighing every word before releasing it. He knew that tone. He'd heard it in debriefs from operators who'd seen too much, the ones who spoke only when silence felt heavier. "Afghanistan," he ventured. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked toward the horizon, where the desert's pale ridges melted into dusk. "You ever notice how mountains change sound?" she asked softly. "The echo doesn't come back the way you expect. Sometimes you fire and wait, and nothing comes back at all." He didn't push further. Whatever that meant, it wasn't about geography. The next morning, the facility's 2,000-meter range shimmered under a hard white sun. Wind danced across the valley, carrying fine grains of sand that whispered against the steel targets. Morrison arrived early again, but Sarah was already there, setting up her gear, calm and deliberate. The Barrett lay assembled, heavy and perfect. She checked her scope mounts, the bipod, the angle of the mat. Every movement spoke of a ritual she'd performed countless times before. "You sure you want to do this?" Morrison asked as he approached. "That range isn't part of the program, it's—" "Optional," she finished for him, glancing up with a faint smile. "I know." He sighed. "Most people don't even see the 2,000-meter target." "Most people don't look long enough," she replied. Morrison settled behind his binoculars as she stretched out prone on the mat. The air shimmered between them and the distant target, a small white square barely visible against the stone ridge. Her first shot came after nearly 5 minutes of stillness. The recoil rocked her shoulder, the sound cracked across the valley. "Miss low and left." Morrison nodded to himself. "Reasonable, it's a hard range." But Sarah just nodded too, calm, adjusting nothing but the smallest fraction on her scope. She fired again. "Outer ring." She exhaled slowly, rolled her neck once, then chambered the third round. Morrison watched through his scope as the bullet struck dead center. He felt a low breath escape him before he realized it was his own. "I'll be damned," he whispered. She sat up, expression unreadable, began clearing her weapon. That, Morrison said, still stunned, was a 2,000-meter center hit under live wind conditions. Wind was stable enough, she murmured. Two cross layers, one high, one mid. Once you read the dust line, it's manageable. You make it sound simple. It's not, she said softly, but simplicity keeps you alive. That evening, Morrison made calls. The kind of quiet, cautious calls officers made when they weren't sure if they should. His contact at intelligence, a man he trusted from old deployments, listened silently as Morrison described what he'd seen. The precision, the composure, the kind of marksmanship that bordered on the unbelievable. When Morrison finished, the line was quiet for several seconds before his friend finally spoke. "Jake, don't ask for names. Just know there are people out there who make those shots, people who operate where normal rules stop applying. Special units. Special conditions," came the careful reply. "Mountain operations, long valleys, you don't train for those environments, you survive them." There was another pause then. "If she's who I think she is, she's not just a sniper. She's a survivor of the kind of missions that rewrite doctrine." Morrison ended the call with a heavy feeling in his chest. The pieces were forming a picture, but one that didn't belong on any official record. The next morning, Sarah was back on the range, same spot, same rhythm. Morrison approached, but this time he didn't speak. He just watched. She worked through her cleaning ritual, the careful disassembly, the slow inspection of the bolt face. The cloth passed lovingly through the barrel. To anyone else, it might have looked obsessive. To Morrison, it looked like penance. He finally broke the silence. "Sarah, I've trained some of the best shooters in the world. What you're doing, these distances, this precision, it's beyond training. Who taught you?" Her hand paused mid-motion. "I had good teachers," she said quietly, "and a lot of time alone." "That's not an answer." She looked up then, eyes steady. "Neither was your question." For a long time, they said nothing. Only the faint ticking of wind against metal filled the air. Finally she sighed. "In some places you don't get second chances. You learn what works or you don't come back." "Afghanistan," Morrison said again, more certain now. Her gaze drifted toward the far ridges of the Nevada desert. "Mountains teach patience," she said, "and humility. They remind you that the wind doesn't care who you are." 2 days later, Morrison gathered his advanced trainees on the range. Sarah stood before them, reluctant, quiet, uncomfortable under their attention. "This isn't a demonstration," she said. "It's just technique." But what followed became legend inside that facility. She explained the environmental assessments, how to read heat shimmer, how to map wind shears by dust flow, how to measure temperature gradients with improvised methods. Her voice was calm, precise. Every explanation was grounded in practicality, never theory. Then she settled behind her rifle again, aimed at the 2,000-meter target. When the shot came, it was poetry. The recoil, the pause, the clean metallic ring a heartbeat later. The soldiers watching didn't cheer at first. They just stared, because they knew what they'd seen was something that went beyond training. When applause finally broke out, Sarah didn't smile. She just started clearing her rifle, eyes focused on the bolt, on the act of disassembly. A young trainee raised his hand hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said, "what's the farthest shot you've ever taken?" She froze for just a second, long enough for Morrison to notice the shadow that crossed her face. "Longer than this," she said finally, "much longer." There was something in her tone that silenced the group. It wasn't pride, it was memory. That night, Morrison sat in his office long after everyone else had left. He stared at the shooting logs, at the near-perfect scores. He stared at her file again, still full of blacked-out lines and redacted sections, and realized he'd stopped being curious for the sake of evaluation. Now it was personal. He wanted to understand the weight behind her silence. The next time he found her on the range, he didn't approach with questions. He simply sat nearby as she cleaned the Barrett under the desert moonlight. After several minutes, she said softly, without looking up, "You ever fire a shot that changes the way you breathe?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "The kind of shot that doesn't end when it hits the target," she said. "It just keeps echoing, even when you want it to stop." Morrison didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way she said it, calm, steady, almost reverent, told him everything. Whatever Sarah Chen carried inside her wasn't about medals or missions. It was about the cost of precision. The desert wind whispered across the range, moving through the empty lanes like breath through a memory. Morrison watched her hands move over the rifle once more and realized the truth. She wasn't trying to prove she could hit anything. She was trying to remember what it felt like to miss and survive. Now it wasn't curiosity, it was respect, the kind that crept in slowly, uninvited, and refused to leave. Morrison had seen talent before. He trained savants, prodigies, even a few soldiers the brass whispered about. But Sarah Chen, she carried her skill like a secret she didn't want to keep anymore. It wasn't something she owned, it was something that owned her. He couldn't stop thinking about that line she dropped, the way mountains changed sound. The next morning came with a haze of fine dust and a faint metallic taste in the air. Sarah was already at the range again, same position, same quiet intensity. But today, Morrison didn't come alone. Two other instructors followed him, each skeptical but curious. "She's doing another long-range run," one whispered. "Apparently," Morrison replied. "I want you to see it for yourselves." Sarah didn't look up as they approached. She was already running wind tests, her portable anemometer humming softly in her hand. Beside her lay a small tablet displaying ballistic data and weather readings. Every detail was precise, calculated, controlled. "Morning, Commander," she said without turning. "You make this your sunrise ritual?" he asked. "Better than sleep," she said. She lined up the rifle again, slow and deliberate, her breathing steady as the heartbeat of the desert. The instructors behind Morrison exchanged skeptical looks until she fired. The shot cracked like lightning. Dead center. Morrison saw it clearly through the scope, a perfect puncture in the steel plate 2 kilometers away. "Holy hell," one instructor murmured. She didn't acknowledge the comment. She was already adjusting for a second target. This one stood at a slightly different elevation, same range, trickier crosswind. Again, she watched the dust trails, waited for the wind to shift, then fired. Another hit. The silence afterward wasn't disbelief anymore, it was reverence. When she finally sat up, Morrison approached quietly. "You make it look effortless." Sarah shook her head. "Effortless is a lie we tell ourselves to justify repetition." He studied her expression. There was no arrogance, no pride, only fatigue. Not the kind that comes from lack of rest, but from carrying too many ghosts. Later that afternoon, he found her sitting outside the maintenance bay, cleaning the Barrett again. The sun had softened, casting long orange streaks across the compound. "You know," Morrison began, "my friend from Intel said something interesting." She didn't respond, but he continued. "He said there are operators who work in terrain, so unforgiving it rewrites the rules. People who take shots others call theoretical." Finally she looked up. "He's not wrong. Were you one of them?" Her hands stilled. "I was what I needed to be." "Then tell me," Morrison said quietly, "what does it take to make a shot at those ranges, beyond numbers, beyond data?" For a long moment she said nothing. The desert wind hissed softly, carrying the scent of oil and dust. "It takes stillness," she said at last. "Not the kind you learn on a range, the kind that happens when fear and focus become the same thing." Morrison waited. She continued, her voice lower now. "It's not about hitting a target, it's about protecting something, someone. You don't think about distance, you think about why you're doing it. You accept that the shot will change you, no matter where it lands." He studied her profile in the fading light, the way her eyes seemed fixed on some distant horizon that wasn't really there. "Sarah," he said softly, "you ever regret it?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Regret is for those who had choices." 3 days later, the training facility buzzed with unusual activity. Word had spread. A defense intelligence convoy had arrived. 2 unmarked SUVs, clean, black, and out of place in the dust. Morrison met them at the admin building. 2 men stepped out, both in plain clothes but with the unmistakable bearing of soldiers who'd seen combat and moved on to bureaucracy. "Commander Morrison," the taller one said, flashing credentials. "I'm Agent David Park. This is Thomas Gray. We understand you've been inquiring about one of your trainees." Morrison crossed his arms. "I've been trying to understand her performance level, that's all." Park's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say her record isn't something you'll find in standard archives. Her presence here is part of a controlled transition." "Transition from what?" Morrison asked. Gray's tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "A deployment tempo that isn't sustainable. She's earned a step down." Morrison frowned. "You're telling me she's here to readjust?" "In a sense," Park said. "Her skill set was developed under operational parameters most personnel can't even conceptualize. Long-range overwatch missions, high-altitude engagement zones, extreme isolation." "Afghanistan?" Morrison asked. Neither agent confirmed, neither denied. Park leaned forward slightly. "Commander, what you witnessed on that range, the precision, the control, that's not luck or training. That's survival. People like her operate where there's no backup, no margin for error. Where one mistake means an entire team doesn't make it home." Morrison glanced toward the window, where Sarah's silhouette was visible on the far range. "She doesn't talk about it." "She's not supposed to," Gray said. "She's supposed to remember enough to teach. That's all." The agent stood. Park handed Morrison a sealed envelope. "Officially, she's a candidate instructor. Unofficially, Commander, don't dig too deep. You won't like what you find." That night, Morrison sat in the empty dining hall, the envelope unopened in front of him. The building hummed faintly with the sound of cooling vents. He'd seen soldiers burn out before, seen what prolonged exposure to pressure and silence could do. But Sarah, she wasn't burnt out. She was tempered. The kind of soldier who came back from impossible conditions not broken, but reshaped. He finally opened the envelope. Most of it was redacted, but one detail stood out in clean black print. "Operated independently across high-altitude overwatch missions. Confirmed engagement distance, 3,247 meters." He sat back slowly, staring at the number. 3,247. It didn't seem real. He thought of her words, the mountains, the silence, the echoes that never came back. And for the first time, he understood. Her precision wasn't pride, it was atonement. Every shot she fired here wasn't for training. It was to remind herself she still could. Still control the chaos. Still keep her ghosts quiet. Morrison rubbed his temples, a weary sigh escaping him. He didn't know what haunted Sarah Chen, but he knew this much. She wasn't here to prove herself. She was here to remember who she used to be before the record, before the silence, before the distance between the barrel and the target turned into a lifetime. And as the lights dimmed across the compound, he looked once more toward the distant range. She was still there, alone, kneeling over the Barrett, the faint click of metal echoing through the dark. Every sound of that weapon being cleaned carried the same unspoken truth. Some people fought wars once. Others kept fighting them forever. Every shot she fired here wasn't a display of mastery. It was a quiet argument with her past. Morrison leaned back in his chair, the number still echoing in his head. 3,247 meters, 2 miles, the kind of shot that existed at the edge of physics and faith. It wasn't the kind of distance anyone reached by luck. It demanded patience, obsession, and a level of emotional control that bordered on unnatural. He rubbed his temples. What kind of moment forced someone to take a shot like that? What was she aiming at? And what had she lost before she pulled that trigger? The next morning, he found her sitting on the firing platform alone, watching the sunrise burn across the ridges. The rifle rested beside her, already cleaned, already perfect. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Didn't try," she said. "Mornings are easier than nights." Morrison sat down beside her, saying nothing for a while. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, purposeful. Finally, he spoke. "I read your file." She didn't look at him. "Most of it's missing." "I saw enough." For a long moment, neither moved. Then she said softly, "They told you about the record." He nodded. Sarah's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "People like numbers. They make things easier to understand." "It's more than a number." "No," she whispered. "It's exactly that. One shot, one distance, one life." Morrison heard the weight in her voice, the kind that came from remembering details she wished she could forget. "I want to understand," he said quietly. "Not the record, the moment." She exhaled slowly, fingers brushing the rifle's cold barrel. "You ever have a decision that rewrote who you were?" He thought about the question, then nodded. "A few." "Then you know," she said. "That shot wasn't just about the man on the ridge. It was about what came after, the silence that doesn't end when you exhale." That afternoon, Morrison asked her to brief the senior instructors. She didn't want to, but she didn't refuse either. The room was filled with hardened professionals, combat instructors, field evaluators, and tactical officers. They'd seen plenty, but the moment Sarah began to speak, the room stilled. "At extreme range," she began, "you're not shooting at a person. You're shooting at an equation. Every variable you calculate is a piece of the human behind it: distance, wind, temperature, humidity, elevation. Each one is a question. How far are you willing to reach to stop something before it happens?" She explained how heat distortion warped sightlines, how wind shifted mid-flight, how time itself became part of the shot. "At over 3 kilometers," she said, "a bullet's flight can take nearly 4 seconds. You breathe, you pull the trigger, and then you wait. 4 seconds to wonder if you made the right call." Someone asked, "What happens if you did?" Sarah looked at him. "You carry it. There's no reset button at that distance." Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was matter of fact, like she was describing gravity. She didn't talk about her own shot. She didn't need to. Every person in that room knew she'd lived it. That night, Morrison stood outside the facility's barracks, the desert wind whipping dust around his boots. The stars were brutal, bright, endless, uncaring. He thought about all the years he'd spent teaching soldiers to shoot, the countless times he'd said, "Precision saves lives." But now, looking at Sarah Chen, he realized precision could also haunt them. She wasn't training to improve. She was trying to find peace in control, because out there, control had been the only thing standing between life and chaos. He turned when he heard her footsteps behind him. She carried her rifle case, but not like a weapon, like a burden. "You ever wonder," she said, "why the best shots are always the quiet ones?" "Because they've seen the loud parts," he answered. That made her smile faintly. "Yeah," she said, "the loud parts don't leave." She sat down on the steps beside him, looking out into the vast emptiness. "I didn't take that shot because I wanted to break a record," she said after a long pause. "I took it because there was no other option. Our forward team was trapped in a valley. They had no cover, no extraction path. The enemy commander was coordinating fire from a ridge 3 kilometers out. He had mortars zeroed in on them." Her voice trembled for the first time. The only way to stop him was to take the shot. Morrison stayed silent, listening. "I had 4 minutes before he moved," she continued. "We'd already lost 2 men. The wind was erratic, temperature changes from dawn were shifting the air currents. It was almost impossible. "But you did it," Morrison said. She nodded slowly. "I hit him, the mortars stopped, our team got out." "And you?" "I stayed behind." She looked at the ground. "Extraction wasn't possible until the next night. I spent 18 hours alone on that ridge, listening for movement, waiting for someone to come looking for him." "Did they?" Her jaw tightened. "Yes, I had to make more shots. Each one felt smaller than the last." The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, she said, "They put the number in the file, but not the names, not the sound, not what came after." "What came after?" Sarah looked at him, and for the first time her voice cracked. "Nothing. That's the problem. You come back and the world is quiet. People smile. They call it skill, discipline, a record, but they don't hear the echo." She closed her eyes, exhaled slowly. "When the world gets too loud, I come here, clean the rifle, breathe, pretend the echo's finally gone." Morrison didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He realized now why she'd been sent to his facility. Not for training, not for evaluation. For healing. The Barrett wasn't just her weapon, it was her confession. And as she packed it away, he finally understood the strange reverence she treated it with. It wasn't respect for power, it was respect for memory. That night, as the facility lights dimmed and the range fell silent, Morrison stood at his office window watching her silhouette fade into the desert. He thought of all the students she'd influenced already. Their awe, their newfound understanding of patience, their sudden quiet after seeing her shoot. Sarah Chen had turned marksmanship into something sacred, something closer to faith than science. And as the wind carried faint echoes of distant shots into the night, Morrison realized that maybe the echo she heard wasn't meant to fade. Maybe it was the world's way of reminding her that what she'd done, what she'd sacrificed, still mattered. Sometimes silence wasn't absence, it was endurance. The next morning, the sky hung low with desert haze, turning the sun into a dull, white disk. The range was silent except for the slow hum of a generator and the occasional whisper of wind cutting through the aluminum targets. Morrison found Sarah already there again, kneeling, her rifle laid out across the mat like something sacred. He approached without a word. She didn't turn. "I'm guessing you already know what I found," he said finally. She nodded once, still tightening the barrel mount. "You read the number." 3,247 meters, Morrison said quietly. "You made that shot alone." A long pause. "Yes." He waited for her to say more, but she didn't, so he pressed. "That's beyond documented limits, beyond what anyone's trained for." "I didn't have a choice," she said softly. "Sometimes distance is the only friend you have left." He crouched beside her, watching the way her fingers worked, steady, almost graceful, moving like she'd done this ritual so many times it had become a language of its own. "Tell me what happened," he said. She looked up, eyes unreadable. "You wouldn't want to carry it." "Try me." She exhaled slowly, eyes drifting toward the far ridges. It was Helmand Province, winter, high ground overlooking a valley that looked like a scar running through the earth. My unit was pinned in the open, mortar fire from across the ridge. The commander coordinating it was invisible, just a figure with a radio and a scope, but every call he made hit us closer. Her voice dropped as if each word weighed something. "They couldn't move. I was their overwatch. Only shot that mattered was his, but the range was impossible. 2 miles of thin air, crosswinds shifting like breath. I had one chance." She paused, the silence between her words cutting deeper than the story itself. "I did the math in my head, double-checked the wind 3 times, adjusted for temperature, humidity, elevation. Then I waited. 4 hours, flat on my stomach, not moving, not blinking, waiting for him to step forward into the open." Morrison said nothing. He could almost see it, The thin mountain air, the heartbeat in her ears, the slow tremor of patience that turned into stillness. When he finally moved, I pulled the trigger, she said. 3.8 seconds later, he was gone. The valley went silent. Then the wind came back. She swallowed, voice tight. People call it a record. They don't call it what it was, a necessity. A math problem solved by someone who didn't want to solve it. The days that followed shifted something in the facility. Sarah's presence changed from mystery to myth. Students spoke her name in quiet tones. Instructors who'd once measured themselves by precision now found humility instead. Morrison noticed it in their posture, their focus, their sudden reverence for silence. She never spoke about the record again. She just taught, calm, methodical, relentless. During one session, she walked the advanced trainees through the process of calculating long-range wind drift without instruments. At these distances, she said, numbers can lie. Feel the air. Watch the ground. Nature tells the truth before your equipment does. When one of them asked how far was too far, she gave a small, sad smile. Far isn't measured in meters, she said. It's measured in what you lose when you take the shot. Morrison stood at the back of the classroom, arms folded, watching her work. He noticed how her voice softened when students struggled, how she never raised it, never mocked mistakes. She was teaching them more than marksmanship. She was teaching restraint. After the class, he caught up with her near the armory. "You've changed the way this place feels," he said. She shrugged, adjusting the rifle sling on her shoulder. "Places don't change, people do." "Then you've changed them," Morrison said. "They're calmer, more patient." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Good. Maybe they'll make fewer mistakes than I did." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the desert ridges, Morrison found her sitting alone on the observation tower, legs dangling over the edge. "You don't talk about that mission much," he said, sitting beside her. "There's nothing left to say," she replied. "The file already says too much." "But it doesn't say what it cost." Sarah smiled faintly. "Records don't keep the costs, people do." They sat in silence for a long time, the wind moving between them like an old song neither wanted to remember. Finally, Morrison spoke again. "When you made that shot, what did you feel?" Sarah took a deep breath, eyes on the dying light. "Relief, then guilt for feeling relief, then nothing. It's strange, at that distance it doesn't feel like killing, it feels like deleting. There's no sound, no impact, no face, just absence, the kind that follows you home." She paused, voice trembling slightly now. "I used to think that if I could be perfect, if I never missed, I could control what I lost. But perfection doesn't save you, it just delays the breakdown." Morrison turned toward her. "So why keep shooting?" Her gaze fell to her hands. "Because I'm afraid of the day I can't. The day the wind changes and I can't read it. The day my hands shake." "And what happens then?" She looked at him. "Then I'll know it's over." The next morning, Morrison found her on the range again. Same ritual, same silence, but something had shifted. Her movements were slower, almost reflective. When she fired the first shot, it wasn't for accuracy, it was for release. Morrison watched through the scope. The bullet hit center as always, but this time she didn't reload. She just lay there, breathing quietly, her cheek still pressed to the stock. For a long time she didn't move. Then, finally, she whispered something he could barely hear. "Distance doesn't make it easier." He didn't answer. He just watched the dust settle, the desert reclaim its stillness. In that moment, Morrison realized the truth he hadn't wanted to admit. Sarah Chen wasn't training to teach anymore. She was training to let go. And somewhere between the barrel and the horizon, between breath and silence, she was still trying to make peace with a shot that had never really ended. The sun rose over the Nevada desert in shades of pale gold and muted pink, casting long shadows that stretched across the compound. The air was still cool, but by noon the heat would return with its usual merciless weight. Morrison stood at the edge of the range, coffee in hand, watching Sarah through the morning haze. She was already in position, silent, focused, methodical, as if the world behind her no longer existed. He'd seen her like this before, but lately there was something new in her movements, something heavier. It wasn't fatigue, it was restraint. The rifle lay before her, disassembled into perfect order. Each piece caught the light like fragments of memory. The way she cleaned, checked, and reassembled the weapon was almost meditative. Morrison realized she wasn't preparing for combat. She was performing remembrance. When she finally looked up and saw him watching, she offered a faint nod. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. She gave a small smile. "The ghosts again. Yours or mine?" Sarah looked back down at the Barrett. "Probably both." Later that morning, the facility buzzed with tension. Word had spread that Special Operations Command was sending representatives for a live demonstration. Top brass, field officers, even a few old ghosts from Morrison's past. They wanted to see the woman whose record had become whispered legend. Sarah wasn't thrilled about the idea. She stood beside the range table, checking her ammunition for the third time, her jaw set tight. "You don't have to prove anything," Morrison said quietly. "I know," she replied. "That's the problem." He frowned. "Then why agree to it?" She paused. "Because if I don't, they'll think I'm hiding something, and if I do, they'll still never understand." He wanted to tell her she didn't owe anyone understanding, but he also knew what it meant to serve, to follow orders not because you wanted to, but because you had to. When the visitors arrived, the air seemed to shift. The men and women who stepped out of the convoy carried themselves with the posture of people who'd lived long enough in shadows to forget sunlight. Morrison shook hands, exchanged greetings, and saw the same expression in every one of their eyes when they looked toward Sarah, curiosity mixed with disbelief. "Commander Morrison," one of them said, a Marine colonel with years carved into his face. "This the sniper everyone's talking about." Morrison nodded toward her. "She's not a sniper," he said quietly. "She's a survivor." The demonstration began under the hard glare of midday sun. The targets were set at 1,500 meters, 2,000, and finally 2,500, beyond the range most soldiers ever dared to attempt. Sarah took her time setting up. No theatrics, no rush, just quiet calibration. The officials stood back, murmuring among themselves, and Morrison watched as she adjusted her scope, aligning it with that impossible horizon. The first shot cracked through the valley, clean, decisive. A faint metallic echo returned several seconds later. "Center hit," called one of the observers through the radio. The second shot came after a longer pause. The crosswind had shifted slightly, but Sarah read it without even looking at her instruments. She fired, and again the confirmation came through. "Perfect." By the time she reached the 2,500-meter target, the crowd had gone completely silent. The wind was unstable now, the kind of condition that turned precision into chance. Sarah waited. She could feel every current, every breath of shifting air, moving between her and the target like invisible threads. Then she squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared. And after a long, breathless silence, the radio crackled to life. "Impact, dead center." The group exhaled as one. Someone whispered, "Jesus Christ." Sarah didn't react. She just cleared the rifle and began her post-check routine, quiet, methodical, detached. A Navy SEAL commander approached her afterward. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how many people can shoot like that?" She met his gaze evenly. "Very few, fewer still who want to." After the demonstration, the visitors retreated to the briefing room for debriefs and polite conversations. Morrison lingered behind, watching Sarah as she cleaned the Barrett under the shade of the observation deck. He joined her quietly, sitting on the bench beside her. The smell of gun oil hung heavy in the air. "They're calling it perfect," he said. "There's no such thing," she replied, running a cloth through the barrel. Perfection's a lie people tell themselves to ignore the cost. Morrison studied her for a long moment. You're not proud, are you? I used to be, she said softly. Then I realized pride doesn't help you sleep at night. She set the rifle aside and rubbed her hands together as if trying to wipe away something invisible. Do you know what happens when you make a shot like that in combat? She asked. People celebrate. Command writes commendations. They give you medals, but none of that erases the sound that follows, the silence. It's louder than the rifle. Her voice faltered for the first time, barely above a whisper. That silence, it never leaves. Morrison looked down at his hands. You know, I think that silence, maybe it's not punishment, maybe it's acknowledgement. Of what? That what you did mattered, that it saved lives. Sarah's eyes lifted to the horizon. Maybe, or maybe it's just the universe keeping score. When evening came, the facility emptied. The visitors had left, the soldiers had gone to the barracks, and the desert grew quiet again. Sarah stood alone by the range, the sky washed in fading amber light. Morrison found her there, silhouetted against the sunset, her hands resting on the Barrett like an anchor. You could have left after today, he said softly. No one would blame you. She nodded. I could have. But you're staying. I'm not done teaching, she said. And maybe I'm not done forgiving myself. Morrison stepped closer. For what? For surviving, she whispered. The wind picked up, lifting dust across the valley. The same valley that had tested her patience, her will, her humanity. She watched the horizon darken and let out a long, slow breath. People think snipers are hunters, she said finally. But we're not. We're witnesses. We see the cost before anyone else does. The silence stretched, and Morrison understood there were no more questions left to ask. She picked up the Barrett, slung it over her shoulder, and started toward the barracks. As she walked away, Morrison called after her quietly, Sarah. She turned slightly, waiting. He hesitated, then said, For what it's worth, the silence doesn't mean you're alone. She gave a faint, tired smile, the kind that carried years behind it. I know, she said. That's why I'm still here. And with that, she disappeared into the fading light, her shadow long against the sand, the echo of her footsteps merging with the wind. Sometimes, Morrison thought as the desert grew quiet again, dignity doesn't speak. It simply endures. The kind of condition that turned confidence into hesitation. The flags on the range trembled against the wind, the air itself whispering uncertainty. Morrison saw the faint shift in Sarah's posture, that tiny pause between thought and instinct, the moment when doubt brushed the edge of precision. Then she steadied her breathing, one slow inhale, one long exhale. The Barrett thundered. And then came the silence, that 4-second eternity before truth arrived. Impact, the spotter said into the radio. Center confirmed. No applause, no celebration, just quiet awe. Sarah lowered the rifle, her movements deliberate, reverent. For a heartbeat, Morrison thought she might actually look relieved, but her eyes stayed distant, somewhere beyond the horizon. When the officers began to clap, Morrison caught the flicker of discomfort in her face. Praise wasn't comfort to her. It was a reminder. She stood, slung the Barrett over her shoulder, and simply said, That's enough for today. The briefing room filled with muted conversation as the officers filed back in. Coffee steamed. Papers shuffled. Someone laughed, the wrong kind of sound in a room still haunted by what they'd witnessed. Morrison stayed near the back, watching Sarah through the glass. She sat alone on the steps outside, her rifle case beside her, head bowed like a weight was pressing between her shoulders. One of the colonels leaned toward him. You realize what we just saw was textbook perfection. We need to bring her back in. Let her train our Overwatch division. Morrison's voice was quiet but firm. She's not coming back. Why not? Because you don't train someone like her, Morrison said. You listen to them, you let them rest. The colonel frowned. Rest, you're wasting talent. Morrison's gaze never left her silhouette. She's not a weapon, Colonel. She's what happens after the weapon, gone silent. That night Sarah didn't show up for dinner. Morrison found her instead on the far end of the airstrip, sitting on an empty ammunition crate, staring at the stars. You know, he said softly, they're already writing reports about you. Some of them are calling you a miracle shot. Others are calling for a reassignment. Neither's true, she murmured. You don't want to go back out there. She shook her head. There's nothing out there worth going back to. He sat beside her. You miss it though, don't you? Sarah hesitated. I miss the clarity, she said. When you're in the field, every decision has a reason. Every heartbeat means something. Out here, everything's noise. He nodded slowly. Noise means you're alive. She gave a tired smile. Alive isn't always the same as living. They sat in silence, the wind low and warm, carrying faint echoes of the desert. Morrison wanted to ask what she was thinking, but he'd learned that sometimes the quiet answered better than words could. After a while, she said softly, when you look through a scope long enough, you stop seeing people. You see patterns, movement, equations. You stop asking who they are and start asking how far. Her voice trembled. That's what I'm trying to unlearn. Morrison looked out over the empty horizon. Then you're in the right place to start. Over the next few days, Sarah stayed mostly to herself. The other instructors respected the space she kept. But one morning, during a marksmanship lesson, she broke her silence with a simple question to the trainees. What's the most dangerous thing on a battlefield? Hands went up. Bullets, mortars, information leaks. She shook her head. No, the most dangerous thing is certainty. The room fell silent. Certainty makes you arrogant, makes you stop listening. The moment you think you understand everything happening out there, she said, tapping her chest, that's when you stop surviving. Later, Morrison asked her why she said that. Because I need to hear it too, she replied. That night, Morrison received a call from higher command. The words were polite, rehearsed, clinical. They wanted Sarah reassigned. Psychological stability within operational limits, proven effectiveness, unparalleled skill, recommend reintegration. He hung up without promising anything. The next morning, he found her in the hangar, oiling her weapon again. She didn't look up as he approached. They want you back, he said quietly. I figured, she said. The machine never stops turning. You don't owe them that. Her hands paused. It's not about owing. Then why? She looked at him, eyes calm and tired. Because there are still people out there who won't come home if I don't. You can't save everyone. I know, she said, but that's not a reason to stop trying. That night Morrison couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. He reread the reports, the recommendations, the statistics that turned Sarah's life into a handful of numbers. He realized something then. War didn't create heroes. It created survivors trying to remember how to live afterward. And Sarah Chen, she was still learning how. He closed the file and looked out the window toward the range, where the faint silhouette of one lone figure was visible under the moonlight. She was cleaning the Barrett again, as if the repetition could quiet the past. Every sound of that weapon being reassembled was a prayer. Every breath between movements was her way of keeping ghosts at bay. Morrison knew what was coming. He could feel it, the pull she felt, the unfinished business whispering her name from the edges of memory. But for now she stayed. The rifle gleamed in the pale light, patient and still. And as the night deepened, the silence between them wasn't emptiness anymore. It was understanding. Some wars didn't end when the gunfire stopped. They ended when the soldier learned to forgive themselves for surviving. Sarah stood at the edge of the firing range, watching dawn spill slowly over the horizon. The desert shimmered faintly, the air heavy with the scent of gun, oil, and dust. She wasn't holding the Barrett this time. It rested beside her, silent, polished, motionless, as if waiting for her permission to breathe again. Morrison approached from behind, his boots crunching lightly against the gravel. "You didn't sleep again," he said. She shook her head, didn't need to. He studied her profile, the way the morning light painted half her face in gold, half in shadow. "You planning to take that reassignment?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "They want me in a new Overwatch program," she said finally. "Quiet work, high altitude, minimal engagement." Morrison frowned. "Sounds like the same old ghosts with a new name." She smirked faintly. "Ghosts don't change, we just move them around." Later that morning she stood in front of her locker, carefully folding her uniform. Each patch, each thread, seemed to carry its own weight. Morrison appeared in the doorway. "You leaving already?" he asked. "Orders came through this morning," she said. "Transport leaves in 2 hours." He nodded, trying to sound casual. "You sure this is what you want?" She hesitated. "It's what I know how to do." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're not just a rifle and a record, Sarah. You know that, right?" Her jaw tightened. "I used to, somewhere between missions I forgot." He watched as she zipped up her pack. "Then maybe that's what you should be fighting for now, remembering." An hour later, they stood side by side on the tarmac as the helicopter waited in the distance, blades slicing the hot desert air. The sound was deafening, but between them, the silence was louder. "You could stay," Morrison said over the noise. Sarah shook her head. "You know I can't." "Because of the record." She looked down at the Barrett case in her hands. "Because of what it means. People like me, we don't get to choose peace. We just learn how to aim around it." The words hung between them like smoke. He wanted to stop her, to say that she'd done enough, that no one could live forever under the weight of perfection. But her eyes told him she wasn't chasing glory, she was chasing meaning. So he just said, "Then promise me something." She glanced at him. "When you take the next shot," Morrison said, "make sure it's for the right reason." Sarah's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It always is." When the helicopter lifted off, the wind kicked up a storm of dust, blurring the edges of everything. Morrison raised a hand to shield his face, but he never looked away. For a long moment her silhouette lingered against the sun, poised, steady, unshaken. Then she was gone. The desert went quiet again. He stood there until the dust settled, until the faint echo of rotors disappeared completely. Only then did he realize that something strange had happened. The range felt different. The silence she had carried with her for so long, that dense, heavy quiet, seemed to have lifted. It hadn't vanished, it had just changed shape. It no longer felt like grief, it felt like peace. Weeks passed. The facility returned to routine, but the absence of her presence was impossible to ignore. The trainees still mentioned her in their after-hours talk, the way she moved, the way she spoke, the calm precision in her hands. Morrison would walk the range at sunset, and sometimes catch himself looking toward the ridge, half expecting to see her silhouette crouched there again. One evening, he found her old shooting mat still rolled up in the supply shed. He sat down beside it and smiled faintly. She left a single note inside the case. The handwriting was clean, sharp, the kind of script that belonged to someone who measured words the same way she measured distance. It read, "I once thought distance protected me, but it never did. It just gave me room to see who I'd become. Don't let them chase the numbers, Commander. Teach them to listen for the silence instead." Morrison read it twice, then folded it gently and tucked it into his pocket. He walked out onto the range as the sun dipped low, the desert painted in fire and amber. The wind moved softly through the targets, whispering across the sand. And for the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't hear an echo, only stillness. He smiled to himself. Guess you finally made peace, Chen. The world exhaled. And somewhere, perhaps far away in another barren valley, a rifle's breath met the horizon once more, calm, certain, and unburdened. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't come with forgiveness. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.